know what happens to the speakers at the end.
Welcome to Drupal Night, hosted by Byraft. Tonight we have Peter Wolanin talking about Drupal 8 code. Take it away.
Okay, hi everyone. So this talk is fairly technical, but I think for this audience, we should take questions as we go along and have it be a little more discussion because you can find on the internet other recorded versions of this if you want to watch it on the speed lightning version of me talking through it. But if you want to actually learn, let's do that instead. So the title of this talk is sort of a mashup of previous titles I used for it. So Drupal 8, where did the code go? And the answer to the question is from info hooks to plugins. And so we will talk about that. So I'll give you some background and talk about what a plugin is. Show you an example of that, basically going from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, and that the code moved, but it's really fundamentally the same code in a lot of ways. Show you some other ways that you can basically start using plugins. Talk about then more complicated plugins that use configuration, and some background thoughts for if you are defining your own plugins, how you would do that. If you don't know me, you can see I have one Drupal Camp New Jersey shirt there and another one I'm wearing because I really want you guys to all come. I've been a core contributor since Drupal 5. I'm on the Drupal security team. I now work for Byraft as a software architect. Before that, I was at Acquia for 8 years. I helped create some of the Drupal 8 plugins that I'll talk about in terms of defining them in core. And again, Drupal Camp New Jersey, we want you to come. Okay, so in this talk, there's some background that hopefully, I feel like is so fundamental that we stop to talk about that. We're not going to get to the main content of the talk, so you should know something, or at least you're going to hear it here, and that's all the background I'm going to give you, which is about the thing called the DIC, the container or the service container, and that is an object that contains other objects, basically, and those objects are services. They're basically stateless things that do some work. You say, can I have that thing to do some work for me, like make a web request, or tell me the current time, or give me, tell me something about the current host name, the current user. Like those are things that I'm not going to be modifying them. I'm getting information out of them or getting them to do some work for me. The new routing system in Drupal 8. So the big change there is that we essentially using a machine name to define a route, and a route is basically a mapping between a path and some code that returns the output you see on the page. So that's very much like what's in the Drupal 7 menu router, but I'll talk a little bit about why those are interesting later. And the other thing, probably everyone has seen by now, but when it first came, it was a little bit of a confusing thing, was these namespace classes. So if you look at this class name at the bottom, you'll see that it actually has multiple pieces of the class name separated with backslashes, and we use those pieces to basically allow us to have as many classes as we want with a similar name, but they're in this longer namespace that makes them unique, right? And that namespace allows us to do other things like autoloading that I'll mention in the middle of the talk. So the main content here, and basically from here on, interrupt with questions if you have them, is plugins, right? So plugins encapsulate some kind of reusable functionality. So that's one of the very important things to think about plugins. Like I can reuse it. So it's in a class, and in general, the class implements one or more specific interfaces. So interfaces are really an important thing in Drupal 8, and are part of the reason why Drupal 8 is so magically swappable beyond your wildest Drupal 7 dreams, because if something implements an interface, you can basically swap out something else, swap it for something else that implements the same interface, and the rest of Drupal doesn't know about it. So it's like a super advanced version of alter hooks. So in plugins in Drupal 7, so this reusable functionality basically is a combination of what was in Drupal 7 an info hook and an implementation hook. And an easy example to think about is hook search info. Hook search info, if my module implements it, it returns some data and says, I implemented search of some kind, right? And your module also had to actually do that. You had to implement hook search execute. So if I implemented the info hook that says I have this reusable functionality and the rest of Drupal knew how to call it as these other hooks. Similarly for hook block info, right? Again, here are these blocks, but the blocks didn't actually appear unless you implemented hook block view, hook block configure, hook block save. You need to implement all those hooks. Right, so again, the plugins sort of combine these two things, the info hook that gave you the listing or told you the thing was available, and the implementation code that actually carried out the work. So if you use CTools or if you use plugins, basically all these concepts should be already familiar to you. Conceptually, they're almost the same, but the way that they're implemented in Drupal 8 is not the same as CTools implemented them, so you will have to kind of figure out the differences there when you start writing them. And in particular, so plugins, all plugin types in Drupal 8 generally have a plugin manager, and each plugin has a plugin ID. So the plugin manager is one of these services in the service container, and it just is, you ask it, say, can I have a list of plugins? Can I have one of those specific plugins? And can you, make an instance of it and give it to me? That's basically what the plugin manager does, so you don't have to spend your time figuring out everybody's constructor and who they are. The plugin ID can be sort of a static string in its definition, or it can be generated dynamically in a derivative. And I'll come back to derivatives, and we'll talk about those a little more, I think, later. So for a given plugin ID, and I think this is kind of important to lay the framework, is a plugin ID maps to a specific class. And so you get plugin ID, and then maps, basically a way to find a class that is going to be used for all plugin instances that use that ID. But the plugin instance then can be even more specific and combine configuration with that class. So all the plugins are using the same class, for example, but because it's reusable functionality, in many cases I can configure it so that even though it's the same code, it has some different output or different response. Right, so you think down the thing you actually get is a plugin instance, and often that will be a instance of the class that is specifically configured in some way. Anyway, so now we'll dive in a little bit to one of these conversions, and for people that aren't yet comfortable with OO code, I'll just remind you of the saying from Drupal.org, which is a famous old saying from Dries, which is the drop is always moving, which I think he may be backing away from. Which just means basically between versions of Drupal, we allow ourselves to rewrite as much as necessary of the code, to improve Drupal, as long as we have a path forward for your data from previous versions, so that we preserve, compatibility of the data in a sense, but we don't preserve compatibility of the code between major versions of Drupal. What does that mean in this case? As I said, we're basically seeing the code move around from a combination of info, hook, and implementation into a plugin. So in Drupal 7, we have hook image toolkits, which is an info hook, even though it doesn't say info in the name, but that's what it is. All it does is give you back an array. In the array, you can see we have an array key, GD, right? That's the top level key. That's the ID of the image plugin. In Drupal 7, right? And you see, in this info array, coming back from the info hook, we have title, and then we figure out if this particular thing is available based on whether some function exists. Okay, so what do we do in Drupal 8? So Drupal 8, the image toolkit plugin is a class, and one of the standard ways that Drupal 8 uses to discover plugins, which is basically just to list them, is annotations on classes. And the annotation is actually this specially formatted code comment in front of the class. PHP as a language doesn't actually support annotations, so it's kind of hacked in. But if you get this wrong, this annotation, you will actually get a PHP error because it's trying to parse this with a specific parser. And you see that the ID of the plugin is GD, which looks very familiar because that was the ID in Drupal 7, right? So we have a one-to-one mapping here, right? In top level array key, and then in Drupal 7, and the ID of the plugin are exactly the same in Drupal 8. And in fact, this thing is basically just parsed into an array. You see the title. We had a T string in Drupal 7. Here we have a translation annotation says this is translatable string. Again, basically one-to-one mapping. And you see, in this case, we have a function that lets us check if this is available, and it's basically doing exactly the same thing that Drupal 7 is, and checking this particular function exists. So that's kind of the mapping there. So the manager is going to iterate over these and basically make a list of them the same way that Drupal 7 would call that hook and get a list of all the possible image toolkits. So the image toolkit manager, as I said, basically runs over these and is basically going to build up the equivalent of the info hook output for Drupal 7, and is basically just going to get the definitions, and then we're going to figure out which ones are available by calling that isAvailable method on each of them. So that's it. Again, conceptually, Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 are doing the same thing. It's just the code has moved from the info hook in implementation in Drupal 7 to the plugin class and the plugin manager in Drupal 8. And then we can sort of look, dive a level deeper into these implementation functions, hooks. In Drupal 7 here, we're basically invoking desaturate on an image object, right? And then we actually delegate out to the image toolkit and say, find the right image toolkit, and we're going to desaturate that image object using the image toolkit. In Drupal 8, what's kind of interesting is that we're not calling a function on the image object. Instead, we call a method directly on the image itself. So we don't pass the image in as a parameter. We're actually calling, we say, image, please desaturate yourself. Which means, I think, becoming grayscale. And you see that basically, desaturate basically calls a method on itself to desaturate. And when I call the method on myself, I'm again going to delegate to the image toolkit plugin and do the thing, right? So again, it's a very parallel in terms of the code flow, but again, this code has all been dramatically rearranged between the two versions. In Drupal 7, we would actually then go through and basically build up the name of the function we're going to call just by this sort of prefix of the function, and you can see. In the end here, though, we just basically, again, call out to this sort of built-in function in GD and return the value. In Drupal 8, what's interesting is the operations themselves are also plugins. I'm not quite sure why, but this means you could even, if for whatever reason the desaturate operation wasn't working right for you, you could re-implement this, or you could use it in some other context other than this image toolkit. And you see, we compare back and forth, right? We're basically saying function exists, if not function exists, like log an error, otherwise, call image filter. You see in Drupal 8, this plugin is basically doing exactly the same thing. If that function doesn't exist, we're logging a notice, and otherwise we call. Basically, this is sort of roundabout, but we're getting the image object, and then image objects, file, resource, and calling the function on it. So we've gone again, from Drupal 8. This one actually 2 levels of plugin. So we have the image toolkit plugin, and then that uses a bunch of image operation toolkits to actually carry out the work. In Drupal 7, we had the image toolkit list that came back from the info hook, and then we had these implementation functions that would delegate out to the actual underlying built-in functions. So you might be thinking, well, that's great. The code is sort of similar, but what about hooks? We all love hooks. I don't want to lose hooks. That's what makes Drupal Drupal, right? So there are actually still a fair number of hooks in Drupal 8. One of the ones that's interesting in this context is that most plugin managers invoke an alter hook. And that is one of the ways that you could basically enjoy this tremendous swappability of Drupal 8. So this alter hook allows you to look at that list of plugin IDs that's coming back and basically say, that plugin ID should actually use a different class. It shouldn't use the class the plugin manager thinks it wants to use originally. So for example, hook block alter allows you to alter the block plugin definitions. And so if you don't like the way someone did a block, you can basically swap it out, and then their module will still think it's using its own block, but instead it'll be using your version. There are hooks that still just return data and so weren't converted, but a lot of those basically were converted just to be written out as YAML files. So if it's basically just returning some static data, why not write it as a file? Then we can just have a nice human readable file. Others like hook cron, hook entity access, those sort of don't fit in this paradigm. They're still doing Drupal-y things, so those are still there. And if you need to implement them, just do do it the way you always did. So I mentioned the annotation from plugin discovery, but plugin discovery is just sort of generically, as I said, finding the list of plugins. So it is very similar to invoking an info hook, and in fact, you can, if you want to, and you want to be really, retro, you can implement your plugins discovery as an info hook. I don't know why you do that, but Drupal core lets you do it. The discovery process again basically just gives you an array of plugin definitions and corresponding values in the plugin definition. Discovery process will fill in defaults in those definitions, like the provider, which is usually the name of the module. And then discovery can make derivatives. So I mentioned derivatives before, and that's actually one of the really cool things about plugins. So there are a gazillion examples of derivatives, but let's just say you want to have a tab on some page, a local task for every content type. So how are you going to do that? Well, you would do that. We'll see that local tasks are plugins, and you can make plugin derivatives, where the derivative process is basically going to be a dynamic process where you say, okay, find the list of all the content types, or for this one, field UI local task, find all the bundles on this content type, and for every bundle that exists, I'm going to say there's an extra plugin definition that I'm going to generate. So it's kind of a dynamic process at the time of discovery to basically fill up the list of plugins with the extra ones that you want based on some dynamic data. And so this, they don't necessarily come and go immediately. This whole process is basically cached. It's not running on every page load. So this things like content types are good, or bundles are good because they're around. Like they're not going to change from page to page, and you can obviously clear that cache out if you add or remove them. And of course, if you need to do something more dynamic.
You've been moving through this pretty fast. Can you show us a live example of that last one?
Of which?
The dynamically generated.
No, because I reinstalled Dev Desktop. But field UI local task
is the example.
Is the example, right? So the thing that basically puts the tab on saying add and manage fields is on every bundle.
Yep.
Field module doesn't know about all the possible content bundles you might generate in advance. In other words, all the content types. So, if you have a Drupal 8 install, you've been seeing it, you just haven't realized that under the covers, that's what's going on. As I said, you could do this discovery with an info hook, that would be kind of deliberately retro and just do it because you could.
It won't be trendy for another 10
No, it won't be
years,
trendy. It's never going to be trendy. So here are the trendier ones. So YAML-based discovery, which I'll talk about in a little more detail, used primarily by these 4 plugins that are basically menu related in Drupal 8. And so if you, and these are things that you can think of, were largely split off from the way you defined them in hook menu in Drupal 6 and 7. And partly these are YAML based because that is intended to make it easier for people that are getting started with Drupal 8 to just write a static file that provides this definition. The other reason these are YAML based is that basically the 95% to 99% use case is that all of them use the same class to implement them. So it's not actually helpful to force developers. We originally started we're going to force developers to write an empty class with just the annotation for every time they wanted to have a tab on a page. And then people like Angie screamed and tore their hair out and said, no, you can't do that. That's terrible developer experience. We've got to make it easier for people. And we're like, okay, how about YAML files? Everyone loves YAML files. So
Or they will soon.
Yeah. So annotation, I showed you, that's kind of the other trendy, or maybe even more trendy way to do this. And in some cases you have this annotation, but you might not have any configuration, or you might have a very small amount of configuration, but it's not a config entity, which I'll mention a little more about. So there's a few of those, like the image toolkit I already showed you, archiver, and then a lot of plugins in Drupal 8 use a combination of annotation for discovery and then a config entity, which is basically a configuration object to basically, those combination of those two things make a plugin instance. And then, just a word of warning, like, entity types in Drupal 8 are kind of plugins, but please don't look at that as your example. Like, they're so weird and complicated, and just, I mean, it's fine if you want to consider them entities, but don't think about that as an example plugin to base anything else off. Your head will just hurt way too much. So, all right, so we're going to start diving into the code, and I'll show you a little bit more about how you use these plugins, how you would, if you want to add a tab on a page in your module, you want to do some of these other things, how you do that. So, prerequisite, of course, you need a module. The code in this example module, which is totally trivial, but is in a sandbox at Drupal.org, the link will be at the end. You can git clone it if you want to use it as a starting point to muck around with. You need a module. You don't even need a module file, but you need an info file, and the info file is now a YAML file instead of a whatever it was. But it looks almost the same, right? So you just need the name, the type module, the description, and of course we want to be using Drupal 8 Core. So once you have a file like this written, that's all enough for it to appear on the modules page and actually to enable it. Once it's enabled, then Drupal will do things like look for plugins provided by your module, even though there's no .module file. Okay, and so now our first task is we're going to add 2 tabs, 2 local tasks to the page. And I mentioned we're using YAML discovery here, so all we have to do is write another YAML file. So we're going to use it my module links .local tasks, my module links task YAML. Someone decided the naming scheme of those files, and it changed a couple times. I think that's right now. And you'll see YAML file structure, again, very simple. The top level key in the YAML file is the plugin ID. And these are arbitrary, but as with things like hooks and things, it's good to namespace them with the name of your module so you don't accidentally run into someone else's definition. Route names, remember I mentioned that a route name is kind of a machine name that maps some incoming path to the function that provides the output that you see on the page. And we're basically just going to use that to generate the link on that tab. And title, so that's the text we print on it. And then base route, for these is basically where do you want these tabs to appear. Right, so in general, you'll see that base route is the same as the route name of this tab. So this is basically like the default local task, right? So that appears on a particular page and links to itself, and then there's a neighboring tab here. If I clicked over that tab, I would still see this other tab, right? So if you map that back in your head to what you would do in Drupal 7, so that base route basically groups these together and kind of gives them an anchor point, from which they all appear and group together. So one of the interesting things about this, you saw I had route names in there, right? There's nothing about paths and hierarchy, no required relationship between these two things. And if you look at these paths, the routes are actually rendering admin config, also my module settings, and admin config my module list. So you see the paths are completely different, but I can still arrange the 2 tabs to be next to each other. I think this is actually something that people should think about when they're writing their modules. Like, you're used to having to force yourself into a hierarchy of paths in Drupal 7 so that your pages would appear in some sensible relationship to each other with their tabs and other things. But in Drupal 8, you're not actually constrained by that anymore. You can use whatever paths you want and still group these tabs together so you can have a set of related pages regardless of where they appear in the path hierarchy. So personally, I think that's kind of a cool side effect of these changes. It wasn't a main goal, but it's, I think, useful to be aware of. And then, of course, we need routes. And so, I kind of put the cart before the horse here, but, we can go back and define the routes and the code behind them. That's also, by default, in a YAML file. These are not plugins, but in a sense, they're still found with these YAML files. The format of these comes from Symfony, so that's partly why it looks a little weird. We didn't too substantially diverge from their standards. So someone who's a Symfony developer, if you go look at the Symfony documentation for defining routes in YAML files, this will all look actually according to their documentation pretty much. And these, for example, here we have a requirement of access true. This is basically just lets anyone access them. Normally you wouldn't do that. You'd put something else like I need a permission or I need some other specific requirement. The path is defined here. And what's cool about using these machine names for the routes is that you can have more than one route with the same path. Yes?
For access, does it assume user access? And you're passing a permission, or are you defining anything in there that you need to run through?
There are different like predefined keys, so you can. I don't have one. We can dig one in and find one that checks a particular like user access call. So that's like a predefined one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's easy to use. I believe there are some specific for entities, like does the user have access to this current entity as predefined. And then you can, define your own the way you did with access callbacks, essentially.
Okay.
Controller is basically the code that's called, and then the title is the default page title. And I think is also used for the breadcrumb by default.
Can you put in dynamic parts of the path, like the node ID, and then use part of that in your title as a parameter?
You have
So
callback then.
Yeah, so you would have to have the title obviously would have to be dynamically generated. In that case, so you'd have to have a method to do that. For the path, these examples don't have it, but
Dead control is the clicker.
Instead of the % sign
Mm-hmm.
you would use in Drupal 6 and 7, you would use a curly braces with a named parameter. And what's cool is that the name of the parameter you put in there gets mapped to a variable of the same name that is in your controller method. So you can actually don't have to have things in any particular order as long as they have the right names.
Okay.
But these are really simple. So these are really super simple, and these controllers, I won't even bother showing you the code. Basically just print out the name of the class and method they're in. They're just for examples.
So you said that you can have two different sets of configuration at the same path. What happens when you go to that path?
So that depends. So things like panels are starting to use this, and so in I'm trying to think what would happen right now. I mean, obviously you find one, right?
How does it decide which one?
So there are a few different ways. So for example, in requirements, you can actually put a regular expression that one of the parameters has to match. So you could have basically two node/something paths. One of them would have to say that the dynamic parameter has to be a number, and the other route might say that dynamic parameter can't be a number. And so everything with node/something that's a string would match one route, and node/number would match the normal node route, for example. So that's one way you can put requirements on them, so they're matched or not. There is basically a route filter that will go through and you can basically define some mechanism yourself for matching these preferentially. I mean, in general, and we can debate at the end, or maybe over drinks, whether all this work was worth it to switch to using Symfony routes. But I think for things like panels, it is going to want to use those. It's going to want to basically have a collection of a dozen different things that might appear at this given path, and it's going to look at all the context and filter out down to the one that should be serving that page. And so that's kind of using the mechanisms at a little higher level as opposed to kind of hacking them in at the lower level that it had to in previous versions of Drupal. Great. So routes, if you want to understand what all those YAML keys are, you can just go and look at Symfony documentation, basically, as well as Drupal.org docs. For the local tasks, if you want to figure out all the things you can put in the YAML file, the best place for those to look is in the plugin manager, because it sort of knows all the valid keys and documents them there. So this is just a quick hint here, and we talked about some of these. One that wasn't present in those examples was parent ID, so that's how you make subtabs. As you say, like this particular local task, the plugin that's above it is this thing with this other ID. And so again, then the sort of top level, there's one top level tab that's kind of, the anchor, the other ones grouped next to it, and the ones below say what, are basically saying what the parent is. And you can make multiple levels of those even. I forget the rendering may not show more than 3 levels, but you can actually have as many as you want. And wait, of course, for sorting them, and options to do anything else that you wanted to do in terms of rendering the link. And class, right? And so, as it said, the default class is going to be used almost all the time, but in your definition, you can actually say, use this other class. And you might, for example, want a class that dynamically generates the title of the local task in some way, like it uses the username of the current user. So the way you do that would be by defining your own local task class and defining the method that returns the title and doing it there. So another plugin that probably everyone is going to want to use, because it's one of the things you tend to implement very early in your career as a Drupal developer, is block plugins. So probably if you've written a Drupal 6 or 7 module, you've at some point, eventually, or built a site, you want a custom block, and you've implemented hook block in your module. So Drupal 8 blocks are plugins, and these are, I think actually a great use of the plugin system. So each custom block, instead of being like in your hook where you might have a bunch of different blocks defined in the same place, each block is its own standalone class in code. So it makes the code nice and self-contained. And so Drupal 8 has a lot of files, but in the sense of understanding what a particular file is doing, it's actually a lot easier to understand. And blocks are plugins that have an associated configuration object. And so when you, in the block UI, go ahead and you say, I want this block to appear in this theme, in this region, that's basically, the plugin manager basically records that fact in a configuration object. That object is a config entity, which basically just means it uses the same basic interface for interacting with that code as content entities. So it also means the fact that it's using the same kind of interfaces makes it easy for Drupal to list things like configuration entities, so it can list all the active block instances. One of the things in the example I'll show you though, that none of that appears. So Drupal's handling almost all that for us because we're using sort of standard base definition or standard base class, and all that stuff about saving the configuration is handled behind the scenes. So all you have to do is just implement the basics. The other thing that's cool about this is the combination of the class and the configuration entity is a specific block instance, which means in Drupal 8 you can have as many block instances as you want for the same plugin class, which means I can have as many of the same block placed possibly in different regions with possibly different settings as I want. And so that's something people will always sort of upset in previous versions of Drupal, like, oh, I placed the block here, but on this other set of pages I want it on the other side, or I want it to work differently. So Drupal 8, that is now possible, and I think that's one of the fun things here. So blocks implement the block plugin interface. You'll remember I said plugins always have a standard interface, right? So the manager knows how to interact with them without knowing their details. We're going to use this block base class. And if you do that, all you have to do is implement the build method, which is basically the same as hook block view in Drupal 7. You can basically copy and paste your code from hook block view in Drupal 7. That just returns a render array. So in my module, the example module, if you look at the code, you'll see there's Drupal my module plugin block my block class, and that's where this custom block is going to live. So I did mention before namespace, and I'll just take a little side diversion here to talk about autoloading also. So people may think this looks ugly or weird and wonder why we have to have these long class names that have all these levels of nesting. And the reason is actually that we use that under the covers to do the automatic loading of classes. You see that this class name is separated by backslashes. And you can imagine basically taking that last section after the module name. You'll see that the file path to the actual module, to the class file, basically uses those same names. and basically we just replace the backslashes with forward slashes, and we know that under my module's src directory, that's where I go to look for a class of this name. If I said new one of these, the autoloader would say, okay, well, that's not in memory, it doesn't exist. So I'm going to go look at every place that my module might be in the Drupal code base, and under those I look in the source directory and traverse down and see, is this file there? And if it's there, I'm going to include it, and then the file exists. Great, we're done. That's basically the autoload process. So that's a sort of standard across PHP projects now, and is much nicer than Drupal 7's autoloader, which breaks in horrible ways all the time. So
Just
yeah.
this one does break horribly if you move a module without uninstalling it first.
Oh yeah, don't do that.
Yeah. I learned the hard way. Everyone, so you know,
Yeah.
don't ever do that.
There are definitely lots of ways you can still horribly break Drupal 8. They're just different, than Drupal 7. So I said, you only have to implement this build method. That basically is the same as hook block view in Drupal 7. You'll see we have the annotation there, that's telling Drupal that this is a block plugin, and it's an add block annotation. You have to have the right annotation, and you have to be in the right namespace under your module for Drupal to find these things. So, basically as you start, look for an example, basically just copy the pattern of the existing example is the easiest way to go forward. And the block annotation here is pretty simple. You just make up a plugin ID corresponding to your block, give it some administrative label that's going to appear when someone's picking the block. Then you implement this. As long as you're extending that block base, you don't have to do anything else. Just like build up and return a render array. Super easy. Once you've done that, you'll see the block administration page looks quite a bit different in Drupal 8 than it did in Drupal 7. You don't have any list of available blocks on the main page. Instead, you get this button to place block, and if you click that, you'll get a list of all the possible blocks. You can filter that down, so we'll get my module block, the thing I called it, and then annotation. Click place block, and then you get what looks familiar basically from previous versions of Drupal that I can say, I want it to only pair certain content types, certain pages, certain roles, what region, etc., etc. And when I save this, that's when it goes ahead and creates that config entity, which basically tracks the fact that this block is active in this theme, in this region with these various settings. And then Drupal will go ahead and do that. So I'll put it in the sidebar, save it, boom, now I have a block. So that's basically it. That very small amount of code, even though this all sounds complicated, it's actually quite easy to write that small amount of code. Just put the class in the right place, extend the base class, and you got a block. And this, just using those routes I defined, so I'm linking back to my routes where I define those tabs. For sort of self-contained example. And in terms of where the code went from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, this is kind of a side-by-side comparison here. So hook block info basically now exists in terms of getting all the block plugin definitions from the manager. Hook block view is basically this build method I just mentioned, but the nice thing is you remember in previous versions of Drupal you get to deal with this delta parameter, right? And you had to, big switch statement or something, figure out which delta corresponded to which block. Drupal 8, because each block is a standalone class, you know directly from the plugin ID which class to go get, and that class renders your block. A couple cool actually additions in Drupal 8. So in Drupal 7, there's actually no way to dynamically determine block access, so turn the block on and off for certain users. Drupal 8 actually provides a particular access method, so you can, based on the account object passed in, say is this person allowed or not allowed to see the block. Again, this is sort of like not widely used yet, I don't think, but I think great possibility, especially for custom modules for complex sites. Hook block configure was again sort of a weird hook in Drupal 7. You had to deal with a delta and return some kind of form. Drupal 8 uses something much more standard in terms of form API. So you have a form method, a validate method, and a submit method. Drupal 7 didn't even have a validate method. I don't know what you did if you wanted to validate your block config. And then you saved with delta and the edit array, and everyone knows how that works, right? So No, I always had to look it up every time. Drupal 8, you get a standard form and form state. You save the values from the form state. So it's much easier because it works the same way every other form in Drupal works. So I think I mentioned this. So every plugin type must be have the expected annotation and be in the right namespace. Core plugins, I think actually all core plugins now have a custom annotation class. And the annotation class, for the annotated plugins, you want the documentation about the available keys in the annotation. So I showed you for the YAML ones, you have to go look at the plugin manager because there's nowhere else to keep it. For the annotation-based discovery, you look at that annotation class to see what is available, and those annotation classes will also provide defaults. So there is a generic plugin annotation class, and generally you'll extend that and create a custom one if you're creating a new plugin type. I mean, that's not common, but yeah.
What's the benefit of the inconsistency in discovery?
So the benefit was really developer experience. So that set of plugins, the 4 that I mentioned, the 95% use case is using the same class for every single plugin. For blocks, you're always going to implement a custom class. So it makes a lot more sense than in cases where every plugin class has a different implementation. You now have the annotation and the implementation all in the same file in the same place, so it's easy to find and move around and edit. Whereas with the ones in the YAML files, it's like the definition, which is in the YAML file, is a completely different place from the class. So if you use a custom class, now it's a little disjointed, but because that's so rare, it's a lot easier for people to just write the static files when they're getting started than to figure, and the advanced users, aren't going to be thrown off by having the class located somewhere else in the module code.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Something I just wanted to mention, I don't know why you do this exactly, but you don't even need to have discovery. You could point to the plugins that you're defining directly in your plugin manager. So that might be used to say, one of the questions was probably be when to use a plugin versus a service. But are you going to go over that?
That's not in here, but yeah, if you want. You want to talk about it, or you want me to talk about it?
You talk about it.
Okay. Well, sure. So service is basically there's one copy of each service, and that service doesn't generally change, doesn't have any configuration, doesn't have any state. You don't save anything in that service. Plugins, in contrast, is reusable. So the same plugin, there might be many copies of it that are used, and they're both generally implementing some specific interface, and there are mechanisms basically to swap them both out if you need to. But yeah, I would look at. I'm trying to think. I think the big difference is the services. There is only one of any given service, and it should be doing some kind of work, and it might be called from all over the code base. In general, the plugins do something very specific. A particular plugin is doing something very specific, and any piece of code, is probably only going to be used by one piece of code somewhere, right? It's like showing the blocks. Like that's not done many times all over the code base, but many times all over the code base might use the same service.
Right, and another thing too would be like if you have people interacting with it on the GUI, like if there's like some sort of configuration, something like that, it's probably better as a plugin. And in that case, you might have something that you don't want people to make multiple plugins for. I don't know why exactly, but then you could just point directly to your plugins in the plugin manager and not use any discovery.
Yeah.
Which is an option on Drupal.org for some reason. They talk about doing that.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you know of anything that actually uses that without having any discovery?
So sort of for menu link plugins, you can directly save plugins that aren't generated through discovery. So it's a little bit of a weird hybrid, but So there are cases like that where where you may want to directly generate the plugins, but not allow people to build them somehow else. But usually when you're doing this, you're going to start out with something like equivalent to blocks, where there's going to be lots of them and they may be configurable. And so defining a custom annotation. So this is the block annotation class, which is different from a class implementing a block. So this is the class that describes that annotation comment at the top of your class file. And so basically this is a very simple one, basically says ID and admin label, which are the two things that I showed you an example, and some more, those are the allowed, or recognized keys in that annotation. And you'll see that this itself is annotated as being add annotation. So, again, so if you want to figure out what are all the possible things you can put in the plugin definition, that's where you go look. Let's see. Okay, so the last example, how am I doing for time? Okay, no one's getting up and leaving, so it must be all right. So last example is a text filter. So to show you how to implement this as a plugin in Drupal 8 and how the code, again, would basically move in parallel from a Drupal 7 version to a Drupal 8 version. And the example I picked here was the one on Drupal.org, where basically if you put in brackets and hash and the number of an issue, Drupal.org will automatically generate a link to the issue from that custom token, basically. So that's implemented through a custom text filter in the project module in Drupal 7. And so you can see, we have an info hook we start with. We define the top level key here, basically, title, description, a process callback, and a tips callback. And we'll see that these things all basically exist in a very similar way in my Drupal 8 version of this text filter. So in Drupal 8, we're going to have a plugin with annotation. So in a similar way, the ID is equivalent to that top level key. For some reason, these want module listed in there. Title, which is translatable, of course. And then in a very similar way, we have an interface where we get a process callback and a tips callback in the info array. Instead of Drupal 8, we just know we have to implement those methods because those methods are required by the interface. So we have to implement the process method and we have to implement the tips method. And you see that they do basically what you expect, which is the process method takes some text in, runs some regular expression looking for the tokens, replaces them, and returns this object that wraps the actual text. The reason it's doing that, this object actually carries information about the cacheability of this text, so we can actually tell this object various things like this text can't be cached, this text will be cached for this amount of time, this text, invalidate this text if a certain node is changed. So these are all, that's information we can actually add to that object about the cacheability of the result we returned. Then of course the tips function, very similar to what you'd expect, again just tells you how this filter works, and it's what you would see in the admin UI. So again, pretty straightforward to write these things, and you see the mapping again goes pretty much one-to-one from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 if you know where to put it. So I'll just walk through real quickly here. Example, I go to node 1, there's the title, first test post, and then I'll go through and configure this text format into my basic HTML. You can see this text there shows up in the admin UI. I can check that off and save it. Now I'm going to go to my second node, and I want to make a link in the text of my second node back to the first node. So I put square brackets #1, which is the node ID. You'll see the tip shows up down here. I turned off the WYSIWYG getter so the tips would actually show up in this text format. And boom, that's it. I save my second node, and it references and gives me a link back to the first node, similar to how Drupal.org makes those issue links. So again, pretty straightforward. Make a custom text filter. This is, making somehow custom tokens or other custom text filters is something that you often get demands from picky clients and need to do something like this to make the site work. So, creating your own plugins. This is we've already covered actually most of this. Thanks for your question. But if you need to create your own plugin type, this is not too common, but for example, if you defined a CTools plugin type in Drupal 7, or in some other way you have reusable functionality you want to sort of gather up and expose, you should use that annotation-based discovery by default. In almost all cases, that'll make the most sense because it keeps that metadata together with the class. So it's all in one file, it's all in one place, you know how to find it. And then that YAML discovery is only good for the cases where 95% of the plugins are going to use exactly the same class, and that's pretty uncommon, I think, outside of those sort of edge use cases. I will of course post these slides up here, so here's links. You can get the code, some example documentation pages. If you want to see a discussion, sort of background story from Chris Vanderwater, there's a discussion on this page, and then a Drupalize Me blog post unraveling the Drupal 8 plugin system if you want a different perspective on basically the same things I've covered in the talk. So kind of wrapping up, just mention great things about Drupal 8. So we have a widespread use of interfaces, and so because we're using interfaces, anything that uses an interface basically can be replaced or swapped out with a different version. We can do fun things now because of routes, like grouping our tabs together however we want without making the paths follow some pattern. And the route name is the unique thing rather than the system path, and that's what all these are using now. Multiple routes can serve the same path, and a different case of actually matching those is get versus post. So I can have one route, for example, that would be utilized if it's a get request, and have a different route on the same path that I go to if it's a post request. And this was a driving sort of requirement actually because of wanting to have better support for REST API in Drupal 8 core. Because REST API, if you think about, often you will have a resource, which is essentially a path, and if you get the resource, it returns the data. But if you do like a patch request to the same, or delete request to the same path, completely different things should happen. And why should all that code run through the same controller? They should actually find different controllers to handle those different cases. So YAML is all over Drupal 8. If you don't know YAML, you should get familiar with it. It's a nice, simple, human readable way to define arrays and hashes. Drupal 8 is great because you have multiple instances of the same block, and the way that works on the covers is that each of those instances of the block has a configuration entity holding the key details about where and how that block exists. So again, discovery, functionality, reusable functionality, and if you need to define this, again, use annotation-based discovery unless you have a damn good reason not to. So we can go back and take more questions if you want. Again, Drupal Camp, New Jersey. I know you guys want to go. Submit a session. Deadline December 9th. Great people will be there. We have like this really yummy banner image on the site. And the main day is February 4th, February 3rd, training, February 5th, collaboration, mentoring, sprinting, hanging out. So I would love to see you there. And that's it. So any other questions?
Okay. Thank you very
Yeah.
much, Peter.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Well, will you be doing this